State University. This is being recorded so that those who cannot participate will be able to, and we'll send out that link at a later time to a number of people who have asked that we send it to them. We started these community town halls shortly after the coronavirus pandemic struck in early March. This is our 9th community town hall. The purpose of these town halls is to further engage not only with our students and our staff and our faculty, but with our alumni community and the larger community on issues that are timely and relevant. And today's issue is very timely and relevant in light of the horrific killing of George Floyd almost 1 month ago. Our lives have changed in very fundamental ways, and I think it's fair to say that we have been facing back-to-back pandemics. One that was unprecedented in public health, and one that unfortunately is very precedented, and that is racism, and in this particular case, police brutality. We're going to be talking today about a very timely issue, and that is public protests and the legal implications of those public protests, how they're organized, what it means for the future for our country. We've seen unprecedented, I think this is unprecedented, peaceful protests in ways that we've not seen in many years, that have spanned generations and races and cultures. And although there had been some unfortunate incidents during the course of those public protests, nonetheless, the peaceful protests have been, I think, a game changer in terms of hopefully the first step to some very positive change. Today we have 4 terrific panelists. Professor Susan Becker, a graduate of our law school in 1983. She's got lots of different titles. In addition to Susan being an alumnus, she's in our Hall of Fame. She's a public interest leader in residence, which means that she is often mentoring and coaching our students and speaking in our classes. And last but not least, she's the general counsel of the ACLU of Ohio. And we're very excited to have Susan once again participating with us. Next, we have Benjamin Grant Chojnacki. Benjamin is a graduate of the class of 2010, a partner at Walter Haverfield, and brings a very interesting perspective, having represented cities in these kinds of in public protests many times. Next is Elizabeth Hopkins. Elizabeth is the Director of Organizing of ACLU of Ohio, and we're very appreciative that Elizabeth is doing this. Elizabeth joined the ACLU not long ago, but has a very impressive history of grassroots organizing, and we look forward to her perspective. And last but not least, what many students describe as their favorite professor. Now, of course, there are other professors on this call, so I've got to be careful with that, people like David Forte and Steve Lazarus, but nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that Kevin may have won the favorite teacher of the award many, many times. And in fact, some people have told me that he's no longer eligible for it because we need to share that distinction with other people. Although I will say Steve Lazarus, I think, has won it many times as well. And Kevin is an expert on the First Amendment and public protests. I'm going to ask each of them to give some introductory remarks about their perspective on public protests, what's been happening, the history of public protests, but particularly the implications of what's been happening over the last 30 days. And then I'll be asking them some more specific questions. We will open this up to questions after I've asked maybe just 1 or 2 sets of questions, and all you'll have to do is unmute yourself and ask the question. There's also a chat function if you prefer not to do it verbally. Amy Miller and I will be monitoring the chat function and make sure you get your question answered. So with all that, let's start first with Professor Susan Becker to give a little perspective on her part, and we'll go to Ben, then to Elizabeth, then to Kevin, and then I'll ask some questions. Susan, let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Lee. Can everyone hear me okay? My volume good?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to just speak briefly on the role that litigation has played and continues to play in protecting the First Amendment and other constitutional rights of protesters. As we all know, litigation is a very common tool that's used to obtain damages for people who are injured, and there's no doubt that protesters have been injured through the use of so-called non-lethal weapons or non-lethal forces such as tear gas and explosive mechanisms that both shoot, loud noises as well as bright lights. There's been use of batons and irritants and all kinds of impact projectiles. So protesters who are interested that way could certainly seek compensation, but the real power, I think, of litigation is in obtaining injunctions and court orders that really require the police to re-examine and change their behaviors based on their policies, especially dealing with use of force when controlling protesters. Now, we have, common litigation is both before the protest begins and then after the protest. It's rare that you would have litigation in the middle of a protest, not completely unprecedented. But in terms of pre-protest litigation, I believe Kevin's going to talk about this a little bit more. We're often talking about issues relating to permits. And of course, the government can restrict the rights of protesters if the restrictions are based on reasonable time, place, and manner, to control the event. Usually it's public safety that is the main concern there. But at the same time, there are limits on all of those. So if a permit is denied or a permit is issued and it's incredibly restrictive, often attorneys will go to court seeking an injunction for a change or an expansion, a granting or an expansion of that permit. One case that the ACLU handled a few years ago, which seems incredibly timely, once again, is right before the Republican National Convention. The city of Cleveland had been planning this for a couple of years, but very shortly before the convention started, they issued their plan, their security plan, which had all kinds of First Amendment ramifications. And I'll just touch on this very briefly. The city created a huge event zone, 3 square miles, which really limited what people could do within that zone, including protests. It had not acted on the parade permits. It was going to permit parades, but it had not acted on them, even though the RNC was just weeks away. And it did allow people to demonstrate, to have parades, but the route was over behind all the sports arenas and over on the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. So no one was going to see them. And if you're going to have an effective protest, someone has to see you. So we filed a lawsuit seeking various damages. And in one of our motions, the point that we made is simply this, that the city's draconian and arbitrary restrictions effectively preclude plaintiffs and thousands of others from making their individual and collective voices heard. This is unacceptable at any time, but it's especially offensive during a presidential nomination convention, a time in which the constitutional rights of every citizen should be showcased rather than suppressed. I think I noticed that Judge Polster is on this program, which is wonderful. We filed in federal court and the case was referred to him for mediation, and he worked his magic, and within a very short period of time, we had a revised plan from the city that allowed expansion of all of these rights, which also allowed as you know, the RNC to go on without a hitch. So free speech and safety can certainly exist in the same space, but absent that litigation, it would have been incredibly restricted. The more common litigation we face is post-protest litigation. And that's what Lee mentioned. And this could be honestly just the post-protest litigation that's erupted following all of the protests related to George Floyd's death. You could teach an entire course on that. And no, Lee, I'm not volunteering to, but an entire course could be taught on that subject. So I just want to mention a couple of examples. So some of the litigation we're seeing, for example, Black Lives Matter, Seattle, King County, and various individuals versus the city of Seattle. This is a classic lawsuit where it's a Section 1983 litigation in which claims are brought not just for First Amendment violations, but in addition, Fourth Amendment violations for excessive force used after individuals had been essentially seized and cordoned off and not allowed to leave the area. What they were seeking and what they continue to seek is orders prohibiting the police from using the weapons like pepper balls and blast balls and rubber bullets and chemical irritants and that kind of thing when it's unnecessary to break up or to move peaceful protesters. And the court has entered a temporary restraining order granting them that relief. But of course, what the court has to do is, of course, has to also think about public safety and things like that. So there are some limitations on this injunction, but it is an example of litigation action that makes a big difference. Another lawsuit that was filed is the Black Lives Matter, the DC affiliate of Black Lives Matters and others, and they're suing the president, the attorney general, the secretary of defense, and others. And I think you know where this is going. This is a class action, and it's based on the activity that the police used and federal agents used to clear out Lafayette Park while the president was journeying over to do his now famous or infamous photo op holding the Bible in front of St. John's Church. And they're seeking similar remedies and injunctive relief in that case. And I have to tell you, these cases are not easy to bring. For one thing, as a practical matter, it used to be really hard. You'd have to have eyewitness testimony. Maybe you'd have a few snapshots here and there. Now everybody has a cell phone. Everybody has video. Media are there. So just pouring through the facts, doing public records requests, all those things, to get all the facts before you can bring a complaint. As a lawyer, that's a really important thing. In addition, there are some pretty significant defenses that are available to police officers individually, the doctrine of qualified immunity. There's also defenses available to city officials, for example, under the Monell Doctrine. You have to show that they're only going to be vicariously liable for the actions of the police officers if the officers were acting as part of a city policy or practice, and that's hard to show now, to show as well. But nonetheless, people do bring this litigation. They get some great relief in terms of injunctive and other relief, and all of it. And the courts this is a challenge for the courts, are in that trying to balance First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, the right to protest. It's so integral to our Constitution and the whole functioning of our democracy. Trying to balance that against safety. So in conclusion, there's just no doubt that litigation has and will continue to play a really important part. But what we need is really meaningful reforms that will prohibit police use of unnecessary force and repression of First Amendment rights. And it's interesting that the protests following George Floyd's death, protests about police abuse of power, are moving the ball forward enormously in terms of creating these reforms we need about restraining abuse of police power. And with that, I'll turn it over to other speakers.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to change the order a little bit. I think I want to go to Kevin next, because Kevin, you've got some historical perspective you can provide with regard to the styles of protests that have occurred, everything going back to Occupy Wall Street and many others. So if you give your perspective on this.
Of course. So I'm going to hit 2 points. First, I want to follow up on Susan's invitation to speak about the role of permits for mass demonstrations and marches. And then I want to talk about how some of the obstructionist tactics of Occupy Wall Street, specifically blockading bridges and interstate highways, are being emulated, I don't think intentionally, but are being emulated in some of the Black Lives Matter protests. And that raises the question of what are the limits of free speech? Where does free speech end and civil disobedience begin? Because there is no First Amendment right to blockade a bridge, as did the Occupy Wall Street protesters when they blockaded the Brooklyn Bridge for 5 hours on a Saturday night, making some of their fellow New Yorkers unhappy. I would think it's only the 1% who can take helicopters and fly over the Brooklyn Bridge. Anyway, let's go back to permits. One thing that I think is that people are not seeing here is the extraordinary protections that are afforded by the case law to protesters who seek in advance a permit to engage in a mass demonstration, march, or parade. As far back as 1941, in Cox versus New Hampshire, the Supreme Court recognized that when large numbers of people are going to take to the streets, it is permissible and not a violation of the First Amendment for the government to ask that they seek in advance a permit. And even if the permit does require a fee, that's okay as long as the fee is not excessive. We won't get into fee affordability. That's a separate question. What's beautiful about the permit case law. As an old ACLU lawyer, it was always our desire to persuade our clients to seek a permit because of the protections afforded. So here are some of the protections created by the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts with regard to those applying for mass demonstration, march, or parade or demonstration permits. First, the government must grant or deny that permit in a very short period of time. The modern cases strike down advanced registration requirements of more than 48 hours. There's another line of case law that requires the government to give you a yes or no answer promptly. In the old days, what the municipalities used to do was to sit on a permit application, neither granting it nor denying it, and leaving the applicant in an administrative limbo. That's all gone. Now you have to get a yes or no answer. If the answer is no, you can hire Susan Becker to be your lawyer and go charging into court and obtain an injunction. Other restrictions on municipal regulation of permits. The permit scheme must be completely clean, completely bereft of any criteria that the administrator, who is the administrator granting and denying these permits? It's often the public safety director, sometimes the police chief. They are not allowed to have any discretion with regard to who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, because of the concern that unpopular speakers will be denied a permit while popular messages will be allowed to march. So the permit scheme has to be bereft of any opportunities for the exercise of discretion. Also, it is not permissible for the permit scheme to allow a permit denial based on the anticipation that people may dislike the message and get violent in response to the protesters. This was exactly why the state of Alabama denied Martin Luther King a permit to march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. A brave federal district court judge down in Alabama ordered George Wallace, no lover of, this was the governor of Alabama, no lover of civil rights, to grant a permit to King and his followers, allowing them to march along the side of the road all the way from Selma to Montgomery. So those are just some of the protections that are accorded those who apply for a permit. Now, the reason that I think it would be advisable to persuade protesters to seek a permit is that when you get a permit, you basically work out an agreement with the municipality of what your march or parade route will be, and you get police protection. The police literally clear the street. It's the similar thing when you see a 10K run or a marathon, exactly the same kind of thing. There is an effort to clear the traffic, reroute the traffic, provide a nice clean parade route, and this would greatly reduce the likelihood of any conflict between police and protesters, as long as the protesters are content to follow the agreed upon parade route. Susan has alluded to possible problems with that area, but again, if you get a permit, you're going to get a parade route, you're going to get police protection, not opposition. Enough about that. If people want to talk about that case law, it's unbelievably protective. So, if you, well, I think I already made the point, if you're denied a permit, you go into court and get an injunction. Now, very briefly on Occupy Wall Street, I'm writing a law review article about the impact of Occupy Wall Street on public protest law. Occupy Wall Street was at its core an anarchist group, and I'm sure that Black Lives Matter is not. And so it's a little unusual to see the Black Lives Matter protesters adopting methods used by an anarchist group that had a very different agenda. So Occupy Wall Street would block bridges, they would block roads. They consciously wanted to, in fact, they had a famous convergence in which thousands and thousands and thousands of protesters just got into the busiest part of Midtown Manhattan and wouldn't move. And they just kind of gummed up the works for hours and hours. Now, unlike Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter has a very specific message that they're communicating. The anarchists at the heart of Occupy Wall Street did not have, they made no demands. And if you get far enough to the left politically, they don't even want to have leaders. And so the thing about Occupy Wall Street was they didn't really have a coherent message. It was more just an effort to kind of obstruct. If a message was added to Occupy Wall Street, it tended to be not from the anarchist core, but from people who kind of joined the organization. They're the ones who came up with some of the messages that are associated with the organization. So I don't think that Black Lives Matter is consciously adopting the methods of Occupy Wall Street. It may just be that when you see images of protests in newsreel footage, these are some of the methods that are used. But I don't think that, I think taking a page out of the Occupy Wall Street playbook is not a good idea strategically or for communicating their message. Okay, so I think I've planted that seed. If you want to talk more about that, we can. I think it's time for me now to be quiet.
Sorry about that. I should note that we have a record turnout for this particular community town hall. Normally we get about 40 participants. Today we have over 70. So that's a real tribute to our 4 panelists and of course to the subject as well. Next, we're going to go to Elizabeth Hopkins, Director of Organizing of ACLU for the organizing perspective. And that is, what is the perspective of those who are protesting? How do they plan it? What kinds of things do they take into account? Elizabeth, we'd love to have your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lee. And thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this moment in time. So I'm Elizabeth Hopkins, the Director of ACLU's organizing arm, which is relatively new. We've realized the importance and the necessity of organizing in the public arena. And I've heard multiple times since I've come on board how excited people are to have organizing as a focus inside of this institution. The way that I've come to the ACLU was through a long history of organizing protests in response to police brutality, organizing around criminal justice reform, organizing for education reforms inside of Cincinnati and across the state. And I think it's important to note that most organizing tactics are very similar. And so to respond to Kevin, when we look at the movement for Black Lives currently adopting some of the Occupy tactics, I would push back and say that it is intentional. I think a lot of folks inside of that movement have been growing weary that people have been organizing and protesting and trying to uplift Black lives for centuries in these United States. And the only way it feels that we are listened to is when we shut things down. And so there are some outliers in this, but I do believe that the purpose of a protest inside of the movement on the ground is to disrupt. And if we are not disrupting, then we're not getting our message across. I would love to see some sort of legislation that would protect these types of tactics. But again, we have to escalate our tactics every time. I'm thinking about a protest that I helped organize in response to the murder of Sam DuBose here in Cincinnati. And Sam DuBose was shot in the head by a University of Cincinnati police officer during a routine traffic stop because he did not have his front license plate. And what happened was a peaceful response in our city. We didn't have rioting, we didn't have looting, we didn't have some of the things that I think Americans have come to couple with protesting. in response to the murders of unarmed Black men and women in these United States. But what we did have was a unified demand that Ray Tenzing be removed from his post inside of University of Cincinnati's police station, but also that we figured out how to keep the university police on the university and not patrolling the streets around the university. What we found was the peaceful protest, the peaceful and calm demeanor that we adopted was good for changing social narrative and somewhat good for changing social consciousness here inside of Cincinnati, but that it was not as effective in actually achieving any sort of legislation. And it was not as effective in actually gaining momentum and really putting a highlight on what's happening in the streets regarding Black and brown bodies with police. I think the moment that we're in right now is so exciting because the massive movement of people who have poured out into the streets, we have seen numbers that are unlike any for day after day after day protests and demonstrations, where Columbus is almost having daily demonstrations. Cincinnati, it's gone to every weekend now, but we're having consistent demonstrations and we're having consistent voices around the table who are demanding for police reform, who are demanding for divesting from the police departments and investing inside of communities that have historically been disenfranchised. And I think none of that would have been possible without this grassroots organizing on the ground. One of the other things that I think is just really special in this moment is the cross-racial organizing that's happening on the ground in these protests. If you walk outside during a protest here in Cincinnati, you are more likely to see more white folks who are on the ground demanding that Black lives be protected and honored than you would see Black or brown folks. And this is unlike any time that I've seen in my career around protesting and organizing. So I think when we talk about why protesting is important, we talk about why organizing is important, and we talk about why mass mobilization is important, this moment really does capture it. We've seen police reforms happening across the United States. We've seen Los Angeles, who has announced they're divesting $150 million from their police budget and investing that into Black and brown communities. We're seeing Confederate statues getting toppled across the United States. And for a woman who identifies as a Black woman in the United States, things like that are so monumental because they show that our voice, that my voice is finally being heard and it's finally being taken serious. So when we're organizing any sort of protest, we always try to make sure that we do have the correct permits, and a lot of times we also try to include city council members, legislators who are amiable to what we're organizing about. We try to make sure that it's cross-cultural, cross-racial. We try to make sure that we've got community leaders who are on board, who can lend their voices, because for a lot of folks who are getting activated in this movement, this might be their first introduction to Black Lives Matter. This might be their first introduction to gay pride marches. This might be their first introduction to really getting in the streets, getting mobilized and getting organized. So it's important that we have that type of unified space where we have different voices who are lifting up the same message and the same narrative so that everyone knows that they belong in this movement. And I think I want to wrap it up with this. No matter what we do around permits, we know that our lives are always on the line. We know that when I'm thinking about the Sam DuBose protest that we had organized against Officer Ray Tenzing, there were snipers on the roof in Cincinnati, on the courthouse roof, with their guns pointed at these protesters who were peaceful, who were having a silent vigil. And so there's always a fear and a concern. And I think what's happening in Columbus right now is just proof that it doesn't matter how you try to organize and protest, the anxiety of having the police there heightens the tension inside of the crowd. And we've seen great work with the police and great work with the protesters coming together. We all have seen pictures of hugs happening and police officers putting down their riot gear to actually join the front lines inside of the protest. We've seen police officers taking knees and really supporting the work of what's happening on the ground. But I think it's important that protesters know, and that people who are getting activated and mobilized in this movement understand that you're entering into a dangerous territory, no matter if you have a permit, no matter if you have great relationships inside of your city or township with the police. It's dangerous territory when you have thousands of people, hundreds of people who are mobilizing, organizing, and lifting up their voices. And yeah, so I'm open to any questions that you all have about the process and also the reasons why. So I'm going to hand it back over to Lee.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next, we're going to go to Ben Chojnacki. Ben represents cities in these situations, so you have a very interesting perspective. What advice you give to cities as they are preparing for protests? Ben?
Thank you very much, Lee. I appreciate it, and I want to thank everyone on the call, and also thank Kevin, Susan, and Elizabeth for your insightful comments. And we really are in a monumentous time. It's in the last month, I've been encouraged and excited by the fact that many of my municipal clients, and just for background, I represent political subdivisions who are the cities themselves, and then the police departments within those political subdivisions. And the commitment to continued improvement that I'm seeing from the law enforcement arm of those departments, paired with the engagement of the legislative arm and the executive branch as a whole, is very encouraging. And I am taken aback by how much work that we are having to do to make sure that every policy and procedure that we have is tightly written and consistent with the best practices as the law enforcement community deems appropriate at this time. That's a very difficult task to achieve in many situations because different departments have different philosophies. So there is a bit of balancing between those pieces. But as a whole, I feel fortunate in my capacity as the lawyer to those communities, because being involved in activities like this and carefully listening to the critiques and comments of what other departments have done, what other municipalities have done, has been a valuable catalyst for continued change within the departments who I represent. And it's causing everyone to take a careful look at what we do, why we do it, and how we can improve. And that's not to say that wasn't the case 2 months ago, but the amount of engagement and scrutiny that police activity is both training and planning and staffing is being subject to is a great thing, and it's increased. And so I'm encouraged and excited by those prospects generally. I want to speak to a couple of the points that Kevin and Susan spoke to. The planning and staffing issues that a police department has in advance of any planned demonstration is a lot. And so the permitting process, and for anyone who's engaging or considering engaging in an exercise that may be more than a few people, pursuing a permit and getting Elizabeth, you said it great, getting the legislators on board and getting if there's the city manager or someone like that on board and ready to assist is so helpful from legal and from the law enforcement side. In smaller departments, and we're seeing this more and more as the demonstrations are increasing, not every small department has the capacity internally to handle what an anticipated demonstration might be. And oftentimes that requires them to call upon mutual aid from other communities or neighboring jurisdictions. When you start getting into that, that always creates a problem or a potential for a problem, because now you're dealing with folks who might not work together as frequently, and it creates a greater opportunity for lines to be crossed. So the sooner that a permit can be submitted and reviewed, and law enforcement and the executive can put together their heads to make sure that they have a plan that appropriately ensures for the safety of the demonstrators, is essential. Because absent that, a lot of times law enforcement's flying in the dark. But if you have that advance notice, you can get on the phone with your neighboring jurisdictions, and you can ensure that you've got boots on the ground who are capable and trained with the philosophy and the understanding that the exercise of your First Amendment rights is something that's lawful and permitted. And so it's an invaluable tool to exercise that right and exercise or afford yourself of the permitting process to the extent it exists. One of the challenges that we're seeing in that respect is that a lot of smaller communities don't have a permitting process in place, and that can in and of itself create a problem, because you'll end up finding yourself in a situation where the municipality may not know what's going to happen and how to staff it. And so they're flying by the seat of their pants, trying to address and ensure that the health, safety, and welfare of the community and the protesters or demonstrators are preserved. And if it's I liken it to a party. If you have time to plan, you know how much food and drinks to buy, you know how many people you need to invite, where the chairs are going to be. But if there's planning and an engagement and cooperative engagement between the demonstrators and the community, certainly it gives everyone the opportunity to ensure that they're well planned and well prepared to address the issues that might come about. The importance of that can't be underscored. I'll touch briefly on the challenge that every law enforcement department has, which is how you navigate those waters where First Amendment rights encroach upon public health, safety, and welfare. And there is no consensus among law enforcement over how best to preserve and protect and navigate those waters. And so, again, the opportunity to get in front of the municipality or the law enforcement agency early, and the opportunity to allow someone like me, legal counsel, to make sure that the folks who are going to be representing the police department or the municipality or whatever the jurisdiction might be, and ensure that they're well informed about what the law requires, is so essential from a legal perspective and from a safety perspective. And it's always better to sit down with the folks who are going to be providing for those services, and ensure that they understand what the law is. Every legal writing professor says, you tell somebody what the law is, then you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them it, then you tell them what you told them at the end. The same thing holds true when you're trying to prepare your client for the event. And that is I can't underscore the importance of that enough. Rather than getting into more detail, I think we've got a pretty active forum, and so I want to make myself, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else's comments. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. Appreciate it. I want to open it up to questions from all of you. I've noticed that there's an active chat function, but first I want to give an opportunity for those of you who want to verbally ask a question. All you have to do is unmute yourself and identify yourself and ask the question. And I'm going to give about 10 seconds for someone to unmute themselves. And if they don't, I go into asking a question. So I'm looking for anybody who wants to unmute yourself. And don't raise your hand, just unmute yourself and talk. Since we have 77 people on the call, it's harder for me to see who's raising their hand and who's not. So it's easier just if you unmute yourself and talk. So who wants to be the first?
I have a question for Kevin.
Yeah, Professor David Forte, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, wonderful presentation from everybody. Very informative. Thanks so much. Kevin and perhaps Ben and the others on. I've been puzzled why there hasn't been more communication about the ability to obtain permits. And I've been puzzled why cities have not proactively offered to make the permit process easy, to send people out to the protesters and provide options for them so that the permit process can protect the protesters more effectively. Do you have any answer to that query?
Well, I was very interested to hear from Ms. Hopkins. She's on the front lines. She knows what's happening right now. And I think that she probably could speak more effectively than any of us about this. I will say this. My reading of the cases and my own experience as an ACLU lawyer is that well-trained police departments understand that most people don't know about the existence of these permit schemes. And so when people do show up en masse in the street, a well-trained police department is not going to arrest everyone for their failure to apply for a permit. They understand that they simply have to deal with the phenomenon that they're confronted with. And I think that they're trained to understand that many people don't even know about the permit process. But I do think that and again, Ms. Hopkins, I think what she has to say is very, very interesting to me. I do think it's a question of strategy, whether or not you want to seek a permit in advance or not. But I defer to what she's saying. Because she's on the front lines and she knows what's up. But I as a lawyer representing protesters, I would always want them to seek a permit, because if they're denied the permit, we go right into court and we get an injunction. If they're granted the permit, but we're unhappy with the terms of the permit, as Susan Becker talked about, we go right into court and seek an injunction modifying those terms. If you do get a permit, you do have traffic control, which means that you are cleared to march and you're less likely to come into violent conflict with the police. But again, I really defer to Ms. Hopkins. I was very interested to hear her remarks. And I think old people like me should be quiet and let her talk.
Okay, Elizabeth, talking to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kevin. I think it's really a matter of timing. So if you have a protest that you know is planned and you have the time to get a permit, absolutely get a permit. It does offer so many protections. And the truth be told, not a lot of folks on the ground understand that there is litigation that can happen if the permit is denied or if the permit does not fit what is needed for the moment. I think some of the protests that we're seeing in this moment are so organic, and there's such a direct response to something that happened yesterday or 2 days ago or even today, that it's hard to slow down enough to go file for a permit, find money to pay for the fee for the permit, wait for the permit to get approved, and then organize around that. So it's really about what's happening in the moment. And I think going back to the basis of why we organize protests in the first place is it's a direct confrontation with power in the public arena. And so sometimes those things need to happen quickly. That's part of what I would say around permits and why more people don't get them, or more movements don't get them.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that question? If not, we'll go to a new one. Anyone have another question? I noticed in the chat function, there are a number of questions. I'll go to the most recent one that says—
Hey, Lee, can we have Ben respond to that last question from the sort of the perspective of the municipality or the city?
Ben?
I'll be brief. Thank you very much. Professor Forte, I think one of the issues, and outside of large jurisdictions, I think there are many municipalities that may not have permitting schemes in place, or they might be so outdated that they might not be used frequently enough for the office holders to be aware of them. So in smaller jurisdictions, they're not always present. But yeah.
Okay. I want to ask a question to all of you, and that is, we've seen actually some very interesting things happen on both positive and the negative side. Elizabeth mentioned that We've seen some police officers take a knee and to join in the protests. We've all made the observation that there have been unprecedented peaceful protests in terms of both size and scale. But we've also seen those who have subverted the process, have engaged in violence or looting. We've also seen police officers who have engaged in brutality against peaceful officers. So my question is, from the city perspective, why isn't there better planning, and how can we prevent police from engaging in the very behavior that's being protested during these protests? And how can we send a message or do anything we can to prevent the looting that occurs that subverts a just and urgent cause of the many peaceful protesters? Who wants to tackle those? Okay, Elizabeth, I'm going to force you to go.
Thanks. I can hop in on the protester side of things. I think we've seen more and more that they're outside agitators, and I hate to use that term, but it's about as truthful as it gets, who are coming into these movements seeking to stereotype the movement for Black lives or the response to police brutality or a myriad of things, seeking to stereotype the folks on the ground as animals and thugs and looters and rioters. And so part of the response for a lot of folks on the ground who are organizing across the nation has been to hold accountable in the moment folks who are trying to break windows, to loot, to riot. I think the Target example in Minnesota is a great one to lift up. In Target, people were denied access to milk in order to pour it into their eyes after getting tear gassed. And so the crowd, the groupthink of the crowd and the anxiety and frustration and angst of the crowd then led to the looting of the Target. That's been condemned from people on the ground in the movement. And I know in Cincinnati and across the state of Ohio, we do not support any sort of looting or rioting. And what I have found is that more often than not, it's not someone who is actually in this movement, organized into this movement. It's outliers and it's outside agitators.
Okay. Ben, your perspective on that?
I think Elizabeth hit the nail right on the head. From a municipal perspective, there's a challenge with providing protections, because sometimes the outliers and the peaceful demonstrators are so commingled that unfortunately the individual officers who are exercising discretion do so poorly, and they don't recognize the distinction, or they take an act of force that doesn't not commensurate with or in recognition of that distinction. There is a lot of opportunity for training and continued improvement in that respect, and the law enforcement community is certainly attempting to better themselves. There is a healthy degree of debate over methods for crowd control and what are the appropriate methods and how they should be used. And I'm not certain there's a consensus among law enforcement at this point, but certainly the challenges of that type of work can be alleviated by advanced planning. And I recognize that that's not always the case, because like Ms. Hopkins said, these things happen organically and there's not enough time, or there is no permitting, or there's no pre-planning that takes place. Folks just show up. But in the process of planning, most departments, if they don't have a piece readily prepared, the chief law enforcement official will draft rules of engagement, and there's a waterfall of how those matters are supposed to be addressed, and it's a continuum of force. And so the opportunity to ensure that the command staff has the ability to clearly articulate that continuum and ensure that everyone from the law enforcement perspective who is going to be present is aware of and exercising the appropriate judgment in how to apply that continuum can only be improved, well, can be improved, not only, can be improved by advanced notice and advanced opportunity for the enforcement community to ensure that everyone is well aware and adheres to those rules.
Could I add something here?
Susan, please.
Thank you. So here's one thing just to keep in mind. There are a lot of models of community policing, right? I mean, I remember a time when community-based policing was going to be a big deal, where you get police out into the neighborhoods and they would know the people they're working with and that kind of thing. And what I've seen both in my career and personally over the years is this militarization of police. And it's not good for police, and it's certainly not good for the public. And what I'm talking about, again, going back to the RNC, when it was planning and the federal government sent, money to plan for the convention, I mean, the city was buying the equivalent of tanks and things and all kinds of surveillance things to keep track of everyone and that kind of thing. And I'm not naive about that. I know police have to deal with dangerous situations, and being in a protest when things go bad is certainly a dangerous situation. But what I've seen again and again and again on these videotapes is that one or two people start some trouble and the police panic. You see the panic in their eyes. They are not equipped and they are not trained to de-escalate. So all of a sudden they're lobbing tear gas and bang grenades and all kinds of things. And then everybody's running around like crazy and bumping into people, and it just escalates into a flat out riot. So I think there has to be, when we look at these models of community policing, there has to be better training for the police on things like de-escalating, but it's more than that. It's the philosophy, and I think Ben is speaking to this, underlying the department. Police officers take an oath, and the oath is to protect and defend the Constitution. So it's not like they're on the opposite side of this battle. It's part of their job to make sure that protests can occur and people can speak their minds. So I think there's an awful lot of changes that have to be made. And I do think, again, the protests following George Floyd's death have really highlighted both the need for changes in abusive police practices, as well as the need to be able to avoid abusive police practices in the protesting situation itself. And I think it's going to make some changes. Elizabeth mentioned that it looks like we're starting to see some real changes, and certainly Ben's message today is very encouraging, but it's going to take a fundamental shift, not a few changes in policies, that fundamental shift in thinking and a commitment that protesting is important and that it's the job of the police to protect protesters, not be afraid of them, and not escalate and attack when they fear for their own safety.
We have two people.
Lee,
on
can
this
I just
call.
wanted to. I'm sorry, can I just make one very quick
Let's
point?
go to Kevin O'Neill, then to Judge Polster, and then I want to go to somebody who was actually the victim of some violence in a protest in Cleveland just recently. Let's go to Kevin first, and then to Judge Polster.
Your Honor, I apologize. If I were in your courtroom, I would be on my knees.
Professors go first.
All right, very sorry, Your Honor. Just a very quick point about the permits. Permits can be required only for mass demonstrations, marches, and parades. They are not required for small gatherings, and courts are extremely hostile to any municipal permit requirement that is directed at small groups of protesters, and they'll strike them down under strict scrutiny. So that's an important point. Okay, I'm very sorry.
We also have a federal judge on the call, and it's Dan Polster. Judge Polster?
Thanks very much, Lee. And I'm only jumping in because Susan gave me a shout out to the RNC 4 years ago. It was not magic, it was hard work, and it pointed out the importance of the permit process and planning in advance. It took 8 hours, but we worked out reconfiguring the substantially narrowing the hard zone to allow more freedom. We worked out a parade march route in front of the convention center. Actually, it was the arena where the Quicken Loans, now Rocket Mortgage, that's where the delegates were, so that the protesters could be seen by the people they were trying to influence, which is the objective. And we also worked out a procedure that the city, when they were giving parade permits, they could say, all right, you can march, but two groups that might really clash, we'll separate and won't put them back to back. We'll put someone else in the middle for public safety. So those things, if you have the advanced planning, you can do it. And candidly, what made it work was that we had a mayor who was about the same age as I am, who remembered Chicago in 1968 and says, hey, we're not going to go there. And so long as people aren't hurting anyone or destroying property, they can march, they can say whatever the heck they want, because that's the First Amendment. So granted, that was 4 years ago, but if you have that kind of a climate and you have the kind of advance notice to the permit process, you can work things out to allow people to exercise their First Amendment rights and protect the public as well.
Some of you may have seen an article in the Cleveland.com recently about a young woman who was injured by the Cleveland police during one of the protests, and she happens to be on the call today. Emily Forsey, could you tell us a little bit about what happened to you and your perspective?
Sure. Thank you so much for letting me be here and share the story. This was the regards the May 30th George Floyd Memorial protest. I am a trained legal observer. I was not acting as a legal observer that day, but I was working within the crowd, writing the number of the National Lawyers Guild on people's arms. And this is a situation where the city and the mayor knew about this protest that was going to be going on, and the mayor and the chief of police had both assured very publicly that they would, that they supported this protest. And what I witnessed that I'm a veteran protester in the sense that I have been working as a legal observer for several years, and I know how this works, and I've never seen anything like this much. Susan Becker bringing up the militarization of the police within an hour and a half. The worst that I saw, some produce being thrown at the police and some graffiti, and within an hour and a half they were using all of the tools I have ever seen into the deep, not just the people that were the agitators with the water bottles and the vegetables and the graffiti, but I mean, we're pepper spray and tear gas and rubber bullets and all deep, far into the crowd of peaceful protesters just chanting. I mean, this was absolutely egregious. And in the following days, all we heard from the press was about the looters and permit and work with the police to protect us at the protest, to protect their brutality against us. And so it's really difficult for me. At the end of that day, I ended up, as I was leaving, which was far away from the crowd, I was walking with my partner down the street, leaving at the end of the day, and I was documenting some of the things that had happened on my phone. And I was taking a picture. This was a story in Cleveland.com yesterday. I was taking a picture of some of the broken windows in the Justice Center, and some deputies popped up out of the broken windows and they shot my partner and I with wooden bullets. And I ducked. It came from my face. I ducked. It got me in my shoulder. It got him in his side, which is not, although that was a very uncomfortable situation for us, of course, and an egregious use of force for people that were exercising their First Amendment right. And honestly, not even that moment. At that moment, we were just two people walking down the street. 22 minutes before we walked down the street, if you've heard that there was a protester that day that lost his eye, those two officers were the same officers that shot his eye out. So that's the situation we're actually dealing with here. And so I think that it's, although, you know, all of the things that have been discussed here today are very important, when you're actually a person that is on the front lines trying to protest police brutality, it's a little bit of a different scenario. And we are not experiencing trained police officers necessarily that have our best interest in mind and protecting our First Amendment rights. And this is actually what we are experiencing, and that's here in Cleveland. And I have tried doggedly for over 1 month to identify even the department, be it either CPD, or, RTA, or the Sheriff's Department, to figure out who, even what department was shooting that day, to try to put in a complaint. And there is not a system set up to put a complaint in with the Sheriff's Department. There is one with CPD, and that's left over from the dissent decree work. And it wasn't until 2 days ago, with the help of an attorney and a lawyer and me just, you know, calling every day to figure out how to even put in that. So that's the situation. And I just appreciate you letting me share this information, because I feel like this is kind of the real deal that we're dealing with right now in this movement.
Emily is a incoming first-year law student at Cleveland Marshall, by the way. We'll be starting in the fall. Okay, let's open it up back again to either comments or questions from anybody. Just unmute yourself and identify yourself, and then please ask the question.
Hey, Lee.
Yes, please.
Ron Adrian.
Judge Ron Adrian, yes.
So I think that Susan really hit the nail on the head. You know, I'm cautiously optimistic that this is actually going to result in a positive change. But, you know, we've seen things start down the right path before, only to get derailed after time. You know, the American public's attention span is notoriously short. And I think that the thing that's most pressing at this point is to really think about this change in mindset that needs to take place in police departments. And I think that that is going to be driven by whether or not we actually are able to take some of the authority away from police unions, because I think that they drive a lot of the mindset for officers, this feeling that they are basically untouchable, regardless of what they do. And, you know, I thought it was really interesting in Minneapolis when the head of the union, having been denied the opportunity to send officers to warrior police training, got money from the union to send them anyhow, you know. And this dichotomy between training officers as warriors, which is us versus them, as opposed to guardians, is really what the mindset change has to be all about. And you know, I'm still, like I said, cautiously optimistic, but you're still seeing a whole lot of people defending the warrior mindset. And I think we got to get past that.
Thank you, Judge. Appreciate that. I noticed that we have on the phone Eric Brown from Columbus. By the way, we have people all over the country on this call, and we're very appreciative of that. Eric is a former member of the Ohio Supreme Court. And I've noticed you've been active on the chat function, but I'm going to now challenge you, Eric, to actually get on this and verbally ask a question and tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Columbus, which has been attracting a lot of national attention.
Yes, highly, and hello to everyone. Situation in Columbus has been constant, both downtown around the State House, at City Hall, and in my neighborhood, the Short North. It's been mostly peaceful, but there have been quite a few incidents where police have responded fairly aggressively. The mayor eventually announced a a change, and he prohibited the use of tear gas and chemical irritants, at least unless there was special concern of danger to civilians or police officers. And the next day, earlier this week, there was such an incident where the police were endangered. There were large plywood boards being used both to protect protesters, but also some of those were used as offensively against police and caused some problems, and they then responded. It did conform to the mayor's order, although I still wish there had been some other training and techniques used by law enforcement. The other thing that's going on here that I am very much involved with, because I'm now serving as a school board member rather than as a judge, is that there's a very active group trying to put the police out of the schools. That's happening around the country. I suspect it's happening there in Cleveland as well. And these young people, mostly young people that are organizing and protesting, have been very active. They've been peaceful, but they're also doing everything they possibly can to get noticed, to get attention, and to include among their demands items that are not reasonable and preclude bargaining or negotiating with them. Here, the board is willing and interested and wanting to make the changes, but does not see as possible the severing of all relationships with the police. And you know, so far at least, that's been asserted as a prerequisite for any conversation. But beyond that, you know, this has been a really helpful discussion, and I appreciate it. And you know, good for everybody who has shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. We're nearing the end, so I would like to give our opportunity for each of our panelists to make some closing remarks. Anything they want to say is fine. I'm going to begin with Susan Becker. Susan, your parting thoughts.
Thank you. I just want to echo what Judge Adrian said about being cautiously optimistic. I have never seen this level of energy for any kind of movement in terms of protest. And I do see incredible opportunity, not just through litigation, although litigation will continue to play a huge role. It really is changing things, but through so many different ways. You know, Ben's comments today are so encouraging about what police departments are trying to do. As I said before, it's going to take a mindset change as well as laws and policy. I do think we're so thankful, we're so grateful, we should all be, for having such a robust and extensive First Amendment. The protections are just almost breathtaking. And I think it's incumbent on every one of us to make sure that we animate those, that we speak up, that we vote, that we do everything that we can so we can change the world into one that we want to see. Thank you. Oh, and one other quick thing, practical matter. There's amazing materials available on the ACLU website and on the law school website, resource guides for protesters, very practical information about how to plan a protest, how to, you know, if you get arrested or detained, what to do and those kind of things. So those are amazing resources and I encourage you to look at those. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Next, we're going to go to Ben. Ben, your parting remarks.
I want to thank everyone for the conversation, and I'm grateful that we've had the opportunity to talk more. And as legal counsel to municipalities and their police departments, I'm grateful that we are listening as well. And the communities that I work with and other communities across the state, I think there is, as Professor Becker alluded to, a sea change. And I do think that there is a an upswell of let's really look at our practices, let's really look at our policies and make sure that we're doing this right. Not to say they weren't doing it before, but I think a continued commitment to improvement over the last month, like I have not seen in my practice up until this point, is going on. And I'm encouraged and excited by that. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I want to go next to you for your parting thoughts.
Thank you so much. I just want to echo what Ben said and also what Susan said. I think that this conversation in this moment is nothing short of amazing. And I also know that the things that we're trying to do inside of the United States and the things that we're trying to do with the moral consciousness of our fellow citizens and of ourselves cannot be done in one short burst. It has to be a long game. We're aware that organizing is a marathon and change is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so I would just encourage everyone who has been on the ground and in the work that you all are doing, and the judges, the administrators and lawyers here on the call, to take time just to ground yourself and to be gentle with yourself in this moment, and take time to hang out with your family and friends and loved ones in this moment. And also, if you're interested in becoming a part of the ACLU's organizing arm, I dropped the link in the chat, and it's acluohio.org/action team. Sign up and we will keep you engaged. Thank you all so much for this time, and I really appreciate everyone on the call.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And let's have some concluding thoughts from our Professor Kevin O'Neill.
Thank you. Just in case you can't hear me, a wrecking ball has arrived and my house is being dismantled right now. So I will stay here no matter what, but there may be some distracting noise. Two quick historical points and then I will be quiet. And they both stem from the optimism expressed by Judge Adrien and by Susan Becker and by Ms. Hopkins. Large, enthusiastic protests work. All you have to do is take a look at what happened with the Vietnam War protesters. Gigantic gatherings and marches of protesters finally caused this country to get out of Vietnam. So it works. And then one last little historical incident. This was also a successful protest, though it took a long time. My historical research, which I used to teach my First Amendment students, indicates that the first people to protest in front of the White House were suffragists who were lobbying President Woodrow Wilson, this is like 1917, for the right, think of this is a controversial idea, for females to vote. And eventually they were successful. They were beaten by Washington, D.C. police. They were jailed. I mean, it wasn't pretty, but day after day after day after day, those suffragists went back and protested in front of the White House and finally did manage to see the 19th Amendment pass. So protest works, sometimes takes a long time, but if you're determined and if you can summon some numbers, you can accomplish your objectives.
I want to thank our four fabulous panelists today, Ben Chojnacki, Elizabeth Hopkins, Professor Kevin O'Neill, and Susan Becker. And I just want to end by telling all of you what we've been doing at Cleveland Marshall. We have issued what we call a call to action, which is a series of action steps that we intend to take to make this more than just a moment, and to do it over the coming academic year and hopefully for as long as we are a law school, to fulfill our mission of learn law, live justice. And we have formed a racial justice work group to keep our feet to the fire to make sure that all the things we've said we will do, that we will do. We also, and Susan Becker alluded to this, have put together a very extensive and deep resource guide on anti-racism and diversity and equity and inclusion. And we hope that between those two things, we can be doing our small part in doing everything we can to fulfill our mission of living justice. And our four panelists do that every single day, and we thank them for that very much. We thank all of you for tuning in. We had a high point today, 80 people on this call, which is pretty amazing. The best attendance we've had up to now is, I think, maybe 50. So this was the best by far because of the subject and also because of the four fabulous panelists and all of you. Thanks for taking your time. We're going to continue to do this all throughout the academic year. So stay tuned. There'll be many more town forums on similar issues of the day. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.